Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
My wife has a friend from graduate school who is now a priest, and he doesn't run the thing, but he's kind of a conduit in this country for a school/orphanage in Uganda. What's interesting is she got a letter from him recently with one of these things showing all the things they do. They built a nice facility there for kids who have lost their parents, particularly for kids who are younger but not very young. So picture a family with kids from maybe starting at age 10 downward. What they do is enable these kids to kind of live in a house, not by themselves, but monitored. So they're not breaking up the family, and the older kids can do a little bit, and there are adults who come in and take care of adult type things. But nonetheless, this is kind of a community that's been built there. What fascinated me is in this letter that this priest wrote, he said that one of the things that they need that will help most toward the kids' educations are water catchment devices. And that sounds strange. This is the stuff that the water that comes off the roof, you catch it and filters it and all of this. And it sounds strange what that would have to do with education, except that much of the kids' time currently is spent walking miles to the nearest water source to bring back water. And the trek is so long that they don't have time left for education. The whole story kind of slapped me in the face because so often in this country, we look and we see problems in other countries and we say, oh, well, what you need is whatever. You need electricity, or you need a new roof on your school, or whatever it is. When in fact, what they really need may be something that we never thought of simply because we're not there. We're not living those lives.
If I may, what they really need is to move.
Well, again, it's easy to say things like that here. I don't know what sorts of constraints are on them. If that was the lowest cost solution, I imagine they would have done that.
I guess, but it's hard to imagine that the lowest cost solution is the one that has them walking away.
No, that's not. The lowest cost solution, or at least in terms of what they need, are water catchment devices. Not computers, not electricity, water catchment devices.
It's very difficult to imagine a life in which many hours are devoted to trudging off to collect water.
Yeah, and that's something that I often would tell my students when they talk about, things aren't great and they were great in the past and blah, blah, blah. I said, look, you turn a lever at your kitchen sink and you get instant water. You can get hot water. You can get cold water. All the water is potable. It's been cleaned and all of that. And that is a new thing. It's something that for all of human history up until about 50 to 100 years ago, humans didn't have.
Yeah, and imagine having to think about that today.
Right, yeah, imagine having to think about that. It reminds me of another story related. This came to me, maybe 10 years ago. There was a Central American country where people were dying, becoming sick from malaria. Americans got together money and sent nets, the nets that you put over your bed to keep the mosquitoes out. The malaria infection rate did not fall. And they investigated to find out what's going on. And the villagers were using the nets to catch fish because that was their greatest need. So the moral of the story is, it's great that we're interested in helping others and blessed that we have the resources to do so. But one of the things we have to be careful of is to make sure we go the extra mile of trying to figure out what it is the people really need as opposed to what we believe they need.
I'm a little more lighthearted this weekend because there's a problem brewing, and that is where to put an apostrophe. Have you stumbled into this issue yet?
I have to stop looking because the misuse of apostrophe, the misuse of quotation marks just drives me insane.
Well, this isn't the misuse of an apostrophe. It's a question as to its proper use and construction when used with Kamala Harris's last name.
Oh, all right. Now, before you say anything, the rule that I learned was if the word ends in S and has more than one syllable, the apostrophe goes after, and there's no additional S.
Interesting. Did nuns beat that into you once upon a time?
Yes. And nuns would be a good example. Single syllable, so the possessive would be nunses, N-U-N-S apostrophe S.
I'm trying to think of a counterexample. I've got Charles as a counterexample. Charles is.
Charles is, yes. Yes, possessive.
So your rule already doesn't work.
No, that's because it's a single syllable.
Oh, I see. So I would have to come up with a two-syllable or multi-syllable word.
Yes, multi-syllable, like Harris. It would not be Harris's.
I'm going to have to give that one some thought, but I'm just going to throw out there a more common sense take on this, which may amount to the same thing and it may not, but the rule should follow pronunciation. I might even be saying the same thing now that I think about it, right? If we say Harris is, it's apostrophe S. If we say Harris, the Kamala Harris administration, you see how idiotic that would even sound. But you follow pronunciation on it. And if you would want to say, that's James, or that's James's, well, the first one would be S apostrophe. The second one would be apostrophe S. And you would always say James's, given pronunciation. And I would say that however you pronounce it, that's how you would notate it. And with Harris's administration, it's apostrophe S every time.
Have we not had this problem before with the president?
I don't know. I'm sure we have, but, we got to argue about something.
Well, it would be nice if we could argue about her policy. Of course, she actually has to state the policy first.
It'd be swell if we knew what they were. This, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week, Ant, and I want to bring you to the small town of Thomson, Georgia, where Mayor Benjamin Benji Carey Cranford was indicted last week by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, faces felony charges because he left a bottle of gin in a ditch that he knew the prison work crew would be going to then the next morning.
Why did he leave a bottle of gin in the ditch?
That's unclear because, felons can't vote. He's not buying anyone's vote, but I guess he just wanted to make the lives of prisoners a little better.
Okay. All right. So I don't know why he's doing that, but that brings me to another question. Why is that a felony?
I don't know. I guess you can't leave laying around that felons will come through on a work crew and get all drunk on in the morning on the work crew hours. For shame on Benjamin Benji Carey Crawford, mayor of Thomson, Georgia. But I gotta say, that's the kind of can-do attitude that I want to see in a small-town mayor. Can we really blame him for this? Is this a blameworthy act? Perhaps we could find Mayor Cranford and get him on, and he could talk about this indiscretion that he committed.
Things must be very quiet in that town.
He's been oddly silent since the incident, and he has had other brushes with the law prior to becoming mayor. Yeah, sounds like a fun guy to me.
Do his prior brushes rise to the level of leaving a bottle of gin at the roadside?
No, he settled a lawsuit. That's not an admission of guilt, of course, that alleged that he tried to hide assets from a bonding company that was on the hook to pay some of his company's debts.
All right. Well, that's actually a serious business.
That other one ain't so great. But leaving a bottle of gin for a bunch of cons coming through on a work crew, I don't know. That seems somehow heroic. Something you would see in a Coen Brothers movie.
Right.
Maybe I'll drop him a line, see if he wants to explain himself.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. One of our listeners wrote and asked if we could talk a bit about the Fed. And as I thought about it, it occurred to me every time we talk about the Fed, we kind of just say matter-of-factly, the Fed raised interest rates or lowered interest rates or whatever it is. And we've never actually talked about what's going on there, what it does and how it does what it does.
I want to go on the record right now saying when that email came in, I said, no, we will not talk about the Fed. No, but I was overruled, and here we are talking about the Fed.
Well, the Fed is topical. The Fed raised interest rates to fight inflation 18 months ago and has held interest rates high It hasn't been the longest period in modern history, but I believe it's the fourth longest. And for the past year, experts have been saying, oh yes, the Fed's going to drop rates next quarter. In fact, as late as March of this year, experts were calling for the Fed to cut interest rates 3 times this year.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, and the latest is that, well, we think that the Fed's going to cut rates in September. And I have been saying for a long time, and I may be wrong on this, particularly given recent events of the past week, but I've been saying for a while we're not going to see a rate cut until 2025. But nonetheless, what we want to talk about is what does all of that mean? I think a good place to start is that what the Fed ultimately is doing is altering the money supply. And this is the thing, you and I talk about saying, well, when the Fed increases the money supply, you get inflation. And in fact, that's where all that inflation came from back in 2022. It was the result of the Fed increasing the money supply to finance all the COVID spending that went on. So we got, not remarkably, a bunch of inflation. The Fed goes to fight inflation. Ultimately, what has to happen is the Fed's got to cut back on the money supply. And the way it does it is by raising interest rates. By raising interest rates, it causes the money supply to decrease.
Let me ask you a basic question. When you raise interest rates, what you really get, people buying less stuff. Think houses and cars, right? The things you have to finance, people will not purchase them to the same degree because they're much more expensive. How does that decrease the money supply?
Yeah, that doesn't. And it's one of the things that people, I think, erroneously point to. And they say, well, the Fed increases interest rates and all the things you just said do indeed happen. It's more expensive to buy a home because of the mortgage rates. It's more expensive to buy a car, all of that. And so people cut back on those big expenses. And that's a significant decrease in demand for products. And people say, well, the decrease in demand for products causes prices to come back down. That's true, but it's only true in the short run, because eventually, if you can leave everything alone, those prices are going to naturally come back up again. That's not a long-term cure for inflation. That's like putting the Band-Aid on when you actually need to set the bone and put a cast on. The long-term cure for inflation is to bring the money supply back. And what happens there is the Fed raises interest rates. We say interest rates plural. Actually, the Fed raises one interest rate. It's the interest rate it pays banks that deposit money at the Fed. When the Fed raises that rate, it makes it more profitable for banks, instead of loaning money to you and me and to companies, to loan the money to the Fed instead. And when the Fed gets hold of that money is no longer in the money supply. You've now had a decrease in the money supply.
It's not permanently out of circulation.
Oh, it is, so long as the banks leave it there with the Fed.
Right, so it's not permanently out of circulation.
Well, no, but in that sense, nothing's permanently out of circulation, because the Fed could turn around and release it again later.
I guess this is starting to sound a lot like voodoo.
Picture the money supply as this pool of water, and the Fed's going to siphon some off by raising interest rates. Now, at some point, people are going to start to feel the pinch, as people have already with, we're paying more for our mortgages and our cars and all of this nonsense, and they start clamoring for lower rates. Okay, but if the Fed drops its interest rate, it makes it cheaper for banks now to turn around and loan to us, or even to go further and to borrow from the Fed and loan that to us. And you get an increase in the money supply. So on the one hand, you do get a decrease in the interest rate, but on the other hand, you run the risk of getting inflation. One of the Fed's charges is to keep prices stable. That is, keep us at a constant level of inflation, which prior to COVID was round about 1 to 2%. I think it's going to be more than 1 to 2% now, but what's been happening is inflation has been, for maybe the past, I'd say, year, maybe a little bit less, has been pretty stable at about the 2% rate. That's one of the things the Fed's charged with doing, keeping inflation steady and low. The other thing it's charged with doing, and this gets really strange, is it's charged with, I should say, growing the economy, keeping us at full employment. And the problem here is those two charges can be mutually exclusive.
How so?
if you're in a situation like we were in 2022, where you've got inflation and you start to see unemployment rising, what do you do? To fight the inflation, the Fed has to raise interest rates. But to increase employment, the Fed needs to encourage businesses to expand, to spend more money, to invest more. That means lower interest rates.
Decisions are going to have to be made.
Yeah, you got to make decisions. It's like charging someone with, I want you to drive from point A to point B as fast and as safely as you can. Well, I'm sorry, that's mutually exclusive.
And the Fed is a creature of Congress. It was formed by Congress. It's overseen to the extent that it's overseen at all. It's overseen by Congress, and it's given its marching orders by Congress. So you could easily see where Congress would tell it to do two things that were wholly antithetical.
Yes. So now it's pretty much up to the Fed to decide which of those two things it's going to do. And that brings us to what's going on right now. So the Fed has been...
Can we stop just 1 second before we get to right now? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I could have sworn that the Fed was founded to put an end to bank panics.
Yeah, it was certainly founded on the heels of bank panics.
So we've got a bit of mission creep here, to say the least.
Economists have looked at this and said, first off, the panics were not due to the absence of the Fed. Secondly, since the Fed was instituted, inflation has been more sporadic than it was prior to the Fed's founding. So it raises the question, even if we look at that original charge, has the Fed been successful? Or I should say differently, would we have achieved that initial charge even without the Fed? In my opinion, part of what happened with the bank panic was less a systemic. There were systemic things that were in play, no doubt. But a large part of what was in play was the fact that for the first time you had a lot of people, not nearly as many as we have today, but you had a lot of people investing in stocks, having money that they were putting into banks as opposed to having a bag of silver under your bed or whatever it is. And they didn't understand how to do this properly. For example, with the stock market crash in 1929, people panicked. They wanted to sell off their stock and get their money in cash and all of this thing. Today, with the stock market crash, it's the reverse. In fact, we had that, whatever it was, 5% drop in the stock market a couple of weeks ago. And what happened? People were cheering, saying this is a buying opportunity.
Buying opportunity, sure.
Which is exactly what they should be doing, right? So we've learned.
Well, we don't give advice here.
No, but when you think about it as you think about anything else, if the price of soda or paper towels or something, whatever it is, dropped significantly tomorrow, most of us would stop by the store on the way home and buy extra because, well, you can get it cheap.
Yes, we would, but things like that, consumer products, there's little chance that the price would drop to zero and stay there.
Yeah, and I would say there's little chance that the price of stocks would drop to zero and stay there. Now, individual stocks, yes.
That's right. There's where I think you and I differ.
But that brings up another point, which is I think people have learned over the generations that if you're going to invest in stocks, you diversify. You don't put everything in one stock.
That's right. But we're drifting far afield here.
The question is, what's happening right now? And that is, the Fed has held interest rates high, and as it's held interest rates high, it's siphoning off this excess money from the economy that it shot into the economy during COVID. If it continues on the path it's following now, the money supply will be back to where it would have been if COVID hadn't happened, sometime in early to mid 2025. And that's why I point to that and say the Fed's not going to drop interest rates till 2025. Now, you put a big footnote there because we have to come back to this dual mandate of, on the one hand, the Fed's supposed to keep inflation low and constant. On the other hand, it's charged with making sure that the economy grows steadily and we don't have, massive unemployment, this sort of thing. If we hit a recession, then all bets are off. You hit a recession, in my opinion, is going to have to abandon, at least for the moment, its pursuit of lower inflation in exchange for dropping interest rates prematurely so that it can give an injection of life to the economy. And what happened? What happened is unemployment has been ticking up for the past few months. which people point to that and say, well, there's a recession pending. Therefore, the Fed's going to need to drop interest rates sooner rather than later. And yet, although the unemployment rate has been ticking up, it's still about 1.5 percentage points below its pre-COVID average. It's remarkably low, despite the fact that it's ticking up. But then, yesterday or day before, maybe 2 days ago, there was an announcement that the Bureau of Labor Statistics had to update the number of job losses that have occurred over the past, whatever it was, 6 to 12 months. And in updating the numbers, they came to the conclusion that we've lost, I shouldn't say lost, they've adjusted downward the number of jobs they think exist by about 800,000.
That's no small thing.
I would say at regular growth rates, that's probably 4 to 6 months worth of economic growth right there. So yeah, not insignificant. But then you've got this weird thing going on. That adjustment has no effect on the unemployment rate.
Now, how can that possibly
Exactly. How can that be? Because we calculate jobs/employment 2 ways. One is we survey businesses and we ask how many people are you employing. The other is we survey households and we ask them, are you working? It's that first set of numbers that got adjusted. The second set is the set we use to calculate unemployment. So in other words, businesses are saying, yeah, we're wrong. We didn't hire a whole bunch of people. We hired 800,000 less than what we had said that we hired. Meanwhile, on the household side, we're not seeing any marked change in those numbers. So the households are saying same number of us have jobs today as had jobs last month.
Let's be clear here. There's nothing nefarious here.
No.
There's no easy way to calculate these things. You're going to get this kind of thing in the data.
Yeah, there's no easy way to calculate it to begin with. But then secondly, I guess people may think that we actually go out and count every single job or count every single person. You don't. That's not possible.
But it's not possible. It's not even close to possible.
If for no other reason, then by the time you got done counting them, the numbers would have changed. These numbers that you're looking at are the result of sampling and statistical arcana that's going on in the background. And so necessarily there's going to be fuzziness in these numbers.
I've got one lingering question that I bet a number of listeners are going to have too. I think you lay out clearly enough what the Fed does with paying on money that it takes in from banks and so on and so forth. But where does it get the money to pay?
Oh, it prints it.
And therein lies the problem.
Yeah, well, let me back off a little bit there. The Fed generally breaks even. It attempts to break even so that the money it brings in from charging banks loans...
Come on, man. I attempt to break even.
Well,
hang
on. It attempts to break even such that the money it brings into itself from charging banks for loans that it makes to them balances with the money it pays to banks for money they deposit at the Fed. And you can see why it would want to break even, because it doesn't want its operations, in that sense, messing with the money supply. That's when the Fed is not actively attempting to alter the money supply as it's doing right now. Now, when you get into a situation like you did back in COVID, where the Fed is injecting a tremendous amount of money. I think they injected, I forget what it was, but maybe $4 trillion or more into the economy.
In the neighborhood, yeah.
Yeah. Where's that money come from? The Fed creates it out of thin air. That's what the Fed does.
That's right. Thin air.
Oh, yeah. Very much so. People take us to task on this. We say, and all economists do, we say the Fed prints money. And people say, no, the Fed doesn't print money. It's all electronic. Yes. We know that. It's electronic. When we say it prints money, what we mean is it created money out of thin air and or incented the banking system to create money out of thin air. But the fact is money out of thin air was created.
That's always a brilliant retort. Oh, no, the Fed doesn't print money.
Well, yeah, I mean, of course.
Fire up the presses in Philadelphia, boys. We got to get more dollars into the economy.
Someone was pushing me on that, saying, well, you shouldn't say that because it's not true. The Fed doesn't print money. I said, it's shorthand for this. And they said, well, it's bad shorthand because the Fed doesn't print money. And I said, hang on. Technically speaking, if you want to really parse it, the Fed isn't printing money at all, even when it does print money. It's some guy, Joe Smith, who's down there at the printing shop who pushes the button. He's printing the money, right? It doesn't matter. We say print the money, meaning the Fed increase the money supply. Now, once upon a time, it actually did involve printing the money, physically sending it out. Since banking's become electronic, we don't mess with that.
The Treasury always printed the money. It's in a Department of the Treasury that doesn't the U.S. Mint fall under Treasury?
Yeah, so the Treasury may actually, I'd forgotten that. You may be right. The Treasury may actually house the machines and push the button that prints the money.
Yeah.
But it's not under authority of the Treasury. It's under authority of the Fed.
Even more fun.
Right, yeah.
Even more fun. How can we get the CIA in on this?
What the Treasury does have authority to do is to mint coins. The minting of the coins is not under the authority of the Fed, but there's a limit on monetary value of the coins they're allowed to mint. This business about the Treasury minting $1 trillion coin is complete nonsense. They don't have that authority. Now, the Fed might authorize them to do so.
Sooner or later, it's going to happen.
Because you reach a point where there is just
That's
mathematically no solution to this problem other than you just print the money.
When we are on the precipice of Venezuela, that's going to happen. It's not going to work. And then all will be lost. Probably this is the end game for the United States economy. So, keep an eye out for weasels in Congress who want to start minting $1 trillion coins.
What baffles me is, on the one hand, the politicians will say this, well, we could just print the money, this sort of thing. But on the other, they want to raise taxes. To which I ask, look, if this is true that you can print the money, why are you taxing us at all?
Leave me alone and go print more money.
Yeah, because ultimately they know exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and what could possibly go wrong.
The net story here is the Fed today controls what's called the federal funds rate. There's lots of details to it. There's no sense going into. At the end of the day, think of this as the interest rate that banks are able to borrow from the Fed. And when banks borrow from the Fed, you now have money entering the system. And so the new money entering the system is going to put upward pressure on inflation. So when the Fed drops interest rates, makes it cheaper for banks to borrow from the Fed, they tend to borrow more. They have an incentive to do so. That injects money into the system, and you start to get inflation. Raise interest rates, and the reverse happens. The banks start depositing their money at the Fed so that they can earn that greater interest rate, but then that's money leaving the system, so prices go down.
You speak in terms of scientific certainty, Antony.
Well, I like to describe this as a stochastic truth, which is what all economics is. People will say, well, it's not a real science. It is a real science, but it's a stochastic science. It's not a deterministic science like physics or chemistry. And the difference is, in a deterministic science, things that are true are always true in every single instance. In a stochastic science, they may not be true in every instance, but they are true on average.
In human things, it's always stochastic.
Yes, anytime the humans are involved, it's stochastic. It's true on average.
And when you hear politicians say we must follow the science, they don't.
The take-home message is it the case that when the Fed increases the interest rate every single time you get inflation? No. It is the case that on average you will.
And it's even better than on average. It's the vast majority.
Yeah, right. It's even better than on average. It's just not true every single time.
You would make good money betting on it if you bet on it every time.
Oh, yeah.
It's that simple. Follow the science, people.
That's all I have to say about the Fed.
I'm thankful.
So, I'll tell you this. A chunk of me believes that we're not going to see interest rates fall again until 2025. And yet, there's so much talk about interest rates dropping in September.
It's an election year.
Well, that's the weird thing, because the Fed is between a rock and a hard place. No matter what it does, raise interest rates or not raise interest rates, it's going to be accused of attempting to throw the election in one direction or the other.
People vote their pocketbook, and if rates go down, they'll be better off.
Yeah, if rates go down, they'll be happier. Now, I think part of what's going on here is the Fed has been deliberately, for the past year or more, signaling that rate cuts are right around the corner so that people don't hunker down and say, okay, well, we're in for a recession, so I'm going to stop buying stuff. I'm going to build up my savings because that will actually cause a recession. if people did that. I think the Fed has deliberately been holding out this thing of, rate cuts are right around the corner to keep us all buying stuff so that we don't get a psychologically induced recession.
I also think they've been saying that rate cuts are right around the corner, knowing it's an election year and they need some cover. So when they do drop rates before the election, they can say, look, we've been saying
it all along. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point.
So, politically, they're going to need that cover. I'd rather not think about literally any of this. The Fed, the money supply.
I'll tell you what.
The election, what's on my TV right now. I'd rather not think about any of it.
Well, I'll tell you one other thing, because you raised the issue of the Fed and politics. The Fed was designed to be somewhat immune from political pressures. So it is run by what's called the Board of Governors. And the term of a governor, this is governor in the sense of Board of Governors of the Fed, not governors of states. The term for one of these members of the Board of Governors is 12 years, specifically designed to be longer than the term of any elected official.
Yeah, it's 2 Senate terms.
Yeah, in an attempt to keep them somewhat above the political fray.
Well, in political time, 12 years might as well be forever.
Oh, yeah. Well, heck, in political times, 2 years is pretty much forever.
2 years is a long time, that's right. We'll see what happens. I suspect you're going to get a little bit of a whiff of good news prior to the election.
I find it harder and harder to hold out against the markets. You can trade futures contracts that reflect your expectation of the future Fed funds rate. Those contracts are pointing currently to a near 100% chance of a rate cut in September.
The contrarian in me says, well, you might be able to get a good deal on the other side of it.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. Right.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.